Hello and welcome to ASM Microbe. My name is Hazel Barton. I'm here to introduce another conversation in a series of conversations in support of a new book from ASM Press, Women in Microbiology. Today, one of the people featured in that book, Dr. Jo Handelsman, is going to be introduced by Pat Schloss, Nichole Broderick, and Courtney Robinson.
Great. Well, thank you all for agreeing to come and talk about one of our great mentors, Jo Handelsman. So Courtney, Nichole, and I were all in Jo's lab at the same time in the mid to early 2000s, and Nichole and Courtney got their PhDs while I was a postdoc. And I think we agree that Jo is such a great mentor to us and all the other people in her lab. And so it's really an honor to be able to talk with you today about your career and what made a difference and what mentors made an impact in your life. So for background, for those of you that don't know Jo, Jo got her undergraduate degree from Cornell University and did her PhD at Wisconsin, where she took her first faculty position in the Department of Plant Pathology. She then went to Yale for a few years and then is now back at the University of Wisconsin. And I think at least the Yale part is trumped, wrong word, is masked by her time in the White House, where she got to serve our country in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, but also serve us as microbiologists as a great voice for science and all the things that Jo cares a lot about. And over her career, she's been an HHMI professor. She was an editor at Applied Environmental Microbiology, which is where I think one of the things that helped me to fall in love with ASM journals. She was the president of ASM prior to joining the White House. And we hear this word metagenomics used a lot at this meeting. And if you didn't know who coined that word, it's Jo Handelsman. And so I think that's something that we lose track of, the vision and creativity, both scientifically, that really impacts our field. And so Jo continues to research at Wisconsin now with a lot of interest in studying microbial communities on plants, and soil, and insects. And she's created a new initiative called Small World Initiative that had a great workshop and sets of presentations earlier in the conference. And so that's the kind of the nitty-gritty, somewhat boring stuff that we see on people's CVs, but there's always far more fascinating things, I think, behind the CV. Like I said, kind of helps us to understand how somebody gets to that point in their career. And so I know the amazing stories of Jo from growing up in the New York area and falling in love with science. And I think you graduated from high school early to take classes at NYU. And one of the things that I see now, and I think we're all part of our efforts to bring girls and women into the STEM disciplines. And I don't know if those types of activities existed back then, but wondering, what types of activities that you were engaged in as a junior high or high school kid that got you interested in science and gave you the passion that you have.
Well, I think it started with my first science course, which is in 7th grade. And I was petrified of taking the class because I was sure I couldn't do science, as so many junior high school girls believe. But then I looked through a microscope, and that was the last word for me. I remember being late to my other classes every time we had a microscope out in science class because I never wanted to leave it. And then I saw a paramecium feeding itself, how they sweep carmine red into their little mouths, and that was love at first sight. And so after that, I knew I wanted to do science, but it was odd because I had this strange image of scientists being in white coats and working on mice and killing animals. And I knew I didn't want to do that, but I somehow didn't make the connection that the paramecium I saw under the microscope were actually something I could study one day. And it took me a long time to work back to microbiology, about a decade.
Very good. And Nichole and Courtney, is that an experience that you all shared? Were there experiences in junior high and high school that got you interested in microbiology?
Well, in the 11th grade, I took my first microbiology course. I had a great micro teacher who was a woman, and I asked her one day, well, what's the highest degree that you have? I can study this. This is awesome. She said a master's degree, and I said, okay, well, what's higher than that? And she said a PhD, and I said, okay, let's do it. And so from the 11th grade, it was all micro.
Yeah, I started pretty young. I think My mom has a story that at 3 I wanted to be a cheerleader, and then I went and visited my uncle's lab and saw Drosophila in a microscope, and then was like, I want to be a scientist. And it changed flavors during my age. You go through the marine biology phase and the paleontology phase. But ultimately, I started doing research as an undergraduate. Thought I wanted to be pre-med, but started doing actual research, fell in love with it, and I've been working on insect gut bacteria ever since.
Wonderful, wonderful. So analogy that I hear a lot and that we see a lot online is the analogy of a leaky pipeline. I believe the current numbers of ASM members that are trainees, about 60% of our trainees are women, and that by the time we get to full tenured professors, it's about 30 to 35% are women. And so I guess wondering what Jo and Nichole and Courtney, what you think what are some of the major factors that attribute to that leak or the leaky pipeline?
Well, I think it's first important to note that microbiology is way ahead of other fields of science and even other fields of biology, which is one of the most rich areas with women. Microbiology has a long history of supporting women's careers, and in fact I was just asking the author of this book to try to figure out what the reason for so many women in microbiology. Back in 1929, Alice Evans was the first president of ASM, who was a woman, and that was 9 years after women got the vote. And I find that just amazing and an incredible tribute to something about microbiology and the egalitarian politics or something else. So microbiology has always been a field that's been easier for women and more welcoming and I think more attractive for whatever reason than a lot of other fields of science. But despite that, we still lose about half of our students between graduate school and faculty positions. I think it's getting better, and it's certainly better than other fields, but I think we're just like all the other fields that we have a drop-off at every stage. And from high school to college, particularly graduate school to postdoc and then to faculty positions, there's a giant drop-off. And part of it is a lot of subtle biases against women in science that I think prevail in every field. It's not certainly just microbiology. And what happens very often is, without intending to, we apply our biases because there's just an unconscious expectation that women are going to be either less committed or more likely to want to have families and not have careers. And all of those things aren't necessarily true, but they can make us not give women as much support and encouragement as we give to our men graduate students and postdocs. So I think that's a big piece of it. There are lots of other things, structural issues about our system that I think probably make it harder for women, for sure. But I think the biases are the single biggest barrier at this point.
Do you think there will be a tipping point at some point where we don't have to worry about such things, or is that it's just always going to be a problem that we need to be conscious of?
I think that the unconscious biases go back so far in our history and seem to develop so early in our development. There's evidence that many of these gender biases start before we're even 2 years old. So I don't think it's ever going to be an issue that we don't have to worry about at all. But I think it certainly gets better. And one of the interesting pieces of research shows that when women are a third of a community, the fact that they're women stops being their paramount characteristic. When you have one woman in a community, the first thing people see is, oh, she's a woman. And I certainly experienced that when I was a young professor, that the first thing people talked about to me was, well, what's a woman doing in this field? Or they would confuse me. At one point there was another woman who was also short in my department, and they always confused me with her. And people would tell me that I worked on peas. I said, I don't work on peas. No, I heard you talk at that meeting. You work on peas, they would say. And it was like there couldn't possibly be two women in plant pathology. And I think that goes away when you have a lot of women in a field. And right now, my current department, plant pathology, has 50-50 men and women. And it really does fade because you can't use that as the discriminating factor among people, because that's half the people who are faculty in that department.
That's great. In to that point of thinking about those subtle biases and getting over certain thresholds, you've had a big role in the microbe meeting that people might not know about. Worked with Arturo Casadevall a number of years ago, looking at trends of if you have one woman on a panel or convener, that totally changes the dynamic of how many female speakers there are. And could you talk a little bit about that study and how that came to be?
Well, that was all Arturo's idea. It came from an observation that I think many of us who were looking at the ASM programs were making, that women just weren't represented as highly as they should be in many of the program areas. And Arturo had the idea of looking at factors that might be responsible for that, because he was head of the ASM program committee at the time. And he began to notice this factor. And I predicted that it wouldn't be a factor, because I figured that it was unconscious biases that were leading to the lack of representation of women. And there's very good evidence that men and women have exactly the same biases and apply them pretty much to the same extent. And so often in academia, people will say, in defense of the fact that they hired a man, they'll say, well, we had a woman on the search committee, as if that would get rid of all the biases. And my own research and others shows that that's just not a factor, that women apply these biases too. So I didn't really think that it would make a difference, and Arturo started doing the calculations, and ASM was great about giving us all the data, and it showed that in fact it made an enormous difference. And there are a couple of reasons why it might be. Partly it may be that women just are more likely to think of other women, but it also could be something that I believe also happens on search committees, and that's that even if the woman isn't advocating for other women, the woman reminds people, gives them that mental image of a senior, successful woman scientist, and it just starts to dispel or at least work against some of the biases that if you don't have the image of a woman scientist in front of you, then all the biases start to kick in. So we don't know why it helped, but it sure made an enormous impact. And then Arturo went on to then encourage the designers of the various, or the conveners of different sessions, to include women, and the following year it totally transformed the numbers of women among the presenters.
That's wonderful. It's a great story. And related to faculty hiring, what are the similarities that you see there? So I guess having women on search committees helps just jog people's memory to remember, oh yeah, we should be thinking more diversely about who we're recruiting. What are some of the other things that you've noticed in trying to recruit more broadly in search committees?
Well, there's research that shows that if you have images of certain kinds of people in front of the members of the search committee, they're more likely to feel differently about people they're reviewing. So for example, if they see very positive images of African Americans, Martin Luther King and great scientists who are African American, they will be more positive toward African American candidates. And if they see very negative images of white men, they will be, again, more positive toward people of other ethnic groups when they're reviewing applications. But that effect only lasts for 24 hours. Most of these things that affect biases only last for 24 hours, which is a little discouraging. So I don't know if the answer is you have to keep showing people images, but one possibility is just to have people envision a diversity of the great scientists or the great microbiologists that they know of before, just out of their memory, and just think about that before they start reviewing applications. And I think that's a practice that can really make a difference, although it hasn't been tested scientifically. Certainly including a diversity of people on search committees can help, but I think recruiting very aggressively men, women, people of all ethnic groups, people of different kinds of backgrounds and from different universities in different parts of the world is a really important part. So often when I make a comment about the lack of diversity in a pool of candidates, they say, well, we sent it to, we sent the ad to, black journals. It's like, that's not sufficient. That's not going to bring in your African American candidates who are out there and great, but may not think to apply. You have to go out there and recruit them. and how many white men were recruited. And people get very embarrassed when you ask that. They realize that they made 10 calls to their buddies and ended up with 10 white men in the pool, and they didn't get a single woman or a minority member, and they start realizing that their biases really were playing a role. So sometimes just training search committees. When I was at Wisconsin the first time, I ran an institute that was about women in science, and we developed a search committee training program. And it was after I left, they actually tested it in a randomized controlled trial, and they found that in fact the departments that were randomly chosen to be trained hired more women as a result of the training. So I think there are some real tricks that we can use that make a big difference.
That's great.
I have a question, just because I think we had somewhat of a unique experience because we kind of grew up in science knowing these stories. And I'm just wondering for my other colleagues, now that we're on the other side of the table, how have you seen like that experience translate into when you're on a hiring committee, or when you're even hiring your own students and things like that?
So it's really interesting. We actually have to do unconscious bias training at Howard University. So I'm a new associate professor now at Howard University. And every time there's any sort of search committee, the entire committee has to do unconscious bias training. And it's because in the past we've had, troubles like this. I mean, everyone carries biases, like Jo said. And so I think that it's really progressive, and it speaks well to my institution that we recognize this and that we're trying to, correct these issues.
Yeah, and to your comments about reaching certain thresholds where it becomes kind of natural, that in my department at the University of Michigan, my chair, Harry Mobley, takes great pride in that we're right at about 50-50. And so when we've got very strong, awesome senior women in my department, you're reminded, right, like that this is kind of what we're about, right? That we need exceptional scientists, men, women, diverse, right? And so that gets baked in, but we're still doing search committee training and things like that to think about those biases. So I remember joining your lab and kind of being a bit shell-shocked, because I came in I'm a biological engineer by training, and I think for the first 6 months I couldn't get a PCR to work to save my life, and I was just like, why am I here? And I was struck by the diversity of people that you had in terms of background. So you had me, and I remember you saying, well, you're an engineer, don't worry about it, like, you think differently, that's good. And I think we had a chemist, we had biologists, plant pathologists, entomologists, and very diverse. And we had a woman that was from science, or history of science in our lab. And I wonder, and on top of that, we also had racial, ethnic, and gender diversity. And I wonder, as you kind of look back on your career, what, aside from the benefits of kind of improving your research, perhaps, or maybe even talking about how does that improve your research, but what benefit has that brought to you scientifically as well as personally?
Well, I think there's no question that the diversity of all types has increased the creativity and the innovation in the lab. And there's a lot of research to back that up, that more diverse groups will solve problems more effectively, they'll come up with more creative solutions, they'll be able to defend their decisions more effectively than more homogeneous groups. And that's based on almost any characteristic you choose. I haven't checked whether it's curly or straight hair will do that as well. I've always been curious how far you can go with that. But they've tried that with age, experience, gender, ethnicity, and it's really quite remarkable how big an effect any kind of diversity of background or characteristics can improve the quality of a group. And so there's no question that that has been a hallmark of the lab and a real joy for me in terms of just getting to know a lot of people who have lived very different lives, have very different education, teach me an enormous amount about the world, about who they are as people, about the science they do. I mean, I would say about all the entomology I know was taught to me by Nichole, and I took one course in entomology 100 years ago, and that's about it. And my students have all been important in teaching me. So I think there's no question that it brings rewards both in terms of the quality of the group the quality of the outcomes, and just the fun of being human in that kind of group. And I found that to an even greater extent in Washington, working at the White House, and to the point that we never really noticed it. And my group was the science division of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And at one of our, we called them lab meetings, but they were, group meetings, one of our interns was leaving. So he gave a talk, and then on the very last slide of his talk, he had a picture of the group, and he said, "And I've been really proud to be your token white man." And we all looked around, and we realized that among about 12 or 14 of us, he really was the only white man. We had white women, we had a lot of black women. For some reason, that was the group I seemed to attract the most in Washington. We had a Hispanic man, we had an Indian man. I mean, it was really quite a remarkable diversity. But when we looked at the other divisions in OSTP, they weren't like that. They were much more white and male. And I've never understood why this has happened. I don't know. I mean, maybe you guys have some explanation, but it just seems like my groups have always attracted more women and minorities and people from outside of microbiology, and so it's been kind of easier for me than other people. I don't know. Do you have an explanation?
Yeah, right.
I don't know. One of the unique things I always thought about your lab, so I actually started as an undergrad scientist in your lab, which was a bit unique, and then stayed for graduate school, is that and so maybe it fits in line with that. I think you were always, seniority was based on when you joined the lab, not on your status. So there was a breakdown of hierarchy that did not necessarily exist. And that actually I found when I went to Switzerland to my postdoc to be a bit of a culture shock for me in that extent, because as an undergrad, when Eric Stab actually left, his bench was open, and another undergrad had been in the lab the longest, and they got his bench, even though a postdoc had started just like was going to be coming in 2 weeks, because you were like, no, you've earned your time, you've done the work, it's your turn to get the space. And so I don't know if it's just because you didn't. You kind of took everyone as, there was an even playing field, and it was what the effort you put in, the time you put in, and you just, I don't know, either that or just really good at putting together really open-minded and good people. And we always had a lot of fun, so.
We had great fun, but I think it also has to do with the image, and so you haven't talked a lot about this, but you've been a great role model for me and countless other people in microbiology. But because your lab was already so diverse and you were so open, it made me feel comfortable, joining your lab, and you had great people in the lab already. And I think that it's really a reflection of you, and so.
It's nice.
And I think the other thing that we've seen Jo do already is that she's very much a scientist, right? So when she talks about gender or how we're going to deal with these inequalities, she's talked about randomized controlled trials, she talks about science, and you're talking about it, right? Whereas I think a lot of faculty don't talk about it, right? And so one of the things I've noticed, if I talk about, that I really need to increase the number of women in my lab, right? Or we need to have more diversity, make things easier for moms that come to conferences with their kids. That people react, right? And so I don't know, I'd like to think, and I suspect that's in your case true, that's attractive to people, right? Are women, minorities that aren't always as well represented.
It's annoying to a lot of my colleagues, I'll tell you that. They roll their eyes, I see it.
Yeah.
But it's funny, I always wonder now what's going to happen in my lab at Wisconsin, because I moved from Yale with 3 people, a post-undergrad and a graduate student and a postdoc, and they all just happen, for accidental reasons, to be Latino men. And somebody at Wisconsin, I was hiring an executive assistant, and we had 2 final candidates, and one of them was a Cuban American who was fluent in Spanish. And they said, well, maybe you should hire him since you only have Latino men in your lab. It's like, that's not a policy, it just happens. But it made me kind of wonder, is that all I'm going to get now? Nobody else is going to be interested in my lab except Latino men, so I have to work on that.
So one of I had the pleasure of having lunch with Jo twice at the White House while she was at OSTP, and I'd always go home and tell my kids that I had chicken nuggets at the White House, which is not true.
Yes, you did. Once you did.
Maybe.
That is funny.
And I always just love seeing portraits up around OSTP of President Obama at the science fairs and looking through the microscope with the kids, and they're just precious, right? Like, I want to get one for my office. I need to figure out how to do that. And I know that you had a lot of fun engaging President Obama with science and microbiology. And I was wondering if you could share one of your favorite recollections with President Obama, where you're talking science with him in the Oval Office or wherever.
Well, that was one of the absolute joys and easiest parts of my job at the White House, which wasn't always joyful and wasn't always easy. But the best part was really talking science with the president, because I don't think we've ever had as science-oriented a president, maybe since Thomas Jefferson, and I doubt we will have one who loves science and cares about science again in my lifetime like that. He called himself a science geek and a science nerd, and said that his favorite day of the year was the science fair, and you could see it. I mean, he just would grin all day long, and he has this phenomenal memory. And so, at the science fair, they would sort of wall off a room so that the reporters weren't there to annoy him, and they would have him meet with about 30 of the kids that came and did their presentations, and they'd range from kindergartners up to seniors in high school. And then he would come in absolutely fantastic spirits, come bounding into the big room where there'd be 150 people and reporters and all that, and he would just not launch into his prepared remarks, but he would immediately start telling us all the 30 projects that he had just seen, and he would describe them in unbelievably accurate detail and remembered all the kids' names. I mean, with no preparation. I mean, that's just how he was. And he would be so excited, and he'd tell you, and I remember one time he said, now this was a really clever invention. If you can invest in this guy's company, he's 14, but I bet he's gonna have a company soon. I think it's a good investment. And of course, his handlers would hate that, because he's not supposed to endorse anything like that. But those were just the moments that were such a privilege to share, that the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, loves science, and what an image to project. And he was also just always eager to learn. When I said goodbye to him, choked up, the thing he said to me was, thank you for teaching me so much, and thank you for my microbes. And what he meant by the microbes was that I gave him a collection. Every time I went to see him, I would bring him one of the giant microbes, the stuffed microbes that we all know so well. And I was always afraid the Secret Service would tackle me or something, because you're not supposed to hand something to the president, and especially something stuffed where you could imagine, I don't know what they're worried about, but something being inside. So I would always put a tiny one, the miniatures, in my suit coat pocket, and then I would give it to him when the Secret Service couldn't see. And he always got this sort of mock serious look, and he would say, oh, and what is this one? And if I would say, it was the Black Plague or something, that was one of his favorites, he'd say, okay, well, this is a dangerous one. I want to keep my eye on this one. And if I'd say, it was cyanobacterium, and this is the one who made all the oxygen for the world that made it possible for us to live here, he'd say, oh, this is a good one, as if he was always surprised. And I would always tell him most microbes are good. I'd give him the good microbe lecture, but he still got surprised every time that a microbe would be good. And it was this playful, joyful thing that allowed me to always share a little bit of microbiology with him. And now I'm told that the collection, which was always in his assistant's desk drawer right outside the Oval Office, always available to him to show people, explain to people, and lecture people about, because he memorized all of them and knew what all of them did, that now it's going to actually be in the Presidential Museum. So I'm excited to go to Chicago and see that.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great note to end this on, Jo. And thank you so much for your service to our country at the OSTP, and to us as a continual mentor, and a great example and role model to so many of us. So thank you so much, Jo, and thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Pat. Should we start?
They tell you to put your chin right there.
I became an ASM member in 1981.
95?
Since 2008.
I joined ASM in 1974.
I've been an ASM member for 41 years.
I first became a member in 1989. Seems like all my career.
I'm willing to bet it's a decade.
My first ASM was 1993. I still have a picture of me holding the program open, sitting on the hotel room bed, really excited because for the first time ever I saw my name in print associated with microbiology.
When I was a graduate student at Purdue in 1980, it was the thing. I mean, if you were going to be a microbiologist, you joined the ASM. It was just really that simple.
ASM is very special to me because I became a member in 2002, and when I first attended the meeting at Salt Lake City, Utah, I met my PhD thesis mentor, Dr. Arturo Casadevall. And so ASM kind of introduced me to the PhD world.
Definitely the most important thing is that ASM has provided me with a graduate fellowship. So they've helped support me during my graduate training. In addition, I've gotten a lot of networking opportunities and I've met a lot of really great people through ASM.
And we can share our work and connect, and they can teach me things that I don't know and I can teach them things that they don't know. And just that partnership and working together, that's what scientists do, to share your work. And it's the most exciting thing to learn about new projects.
ASM has actually done a whole lot of work and given me the kind of exposure I wouldn't have had if I'm not a member of ASM.
Many brains are better than one.
So it's a great thing. It's a really member-driven organization. I love that. I've always loved that.
Could make the bigger the better, the more the merrier.
You want to do microbiology, become a member.